the invisible habit that makes you feel like you're failing. There's a kind of heaviness that doesn't scream. It doesn't break you down in public or make you collapse. It just sits quietly behind everything, behind your efforts, behind your focus, behind your good days and your bad ones. A low-grade hum of unease, like you're not doing enough, not being enough, not becoming what he's supposed to. You might not talk about it. Most people wouldn't understand. From the outside, you're functional, maybe even impressive. You've made it through a lot. You show up, you try, you keep going, but internally, there's this constant recalibration, a feeling that you're somehow off track, even when things are fine, even when nothing is wrong. And the hardest part, you can't explain where it's coming from. Some days, it feels like restlessness. Other days, like guilt. Sometimes it shows up as pressure. Sometimes as a strange kind of emotional emptiness. Like your life is moving, but you're not really inside it. Like you're watching yourself operate, waiting for the moment when it'll finally feel right, but it never quite does. So you push harder, or you numb out, or you start the cycle again. A new goal, a better system, another version of yourself that will finally unlock that elusive piece. That moment where you feel, for once, like you're doing it right. But no matter how much you accomplish, the feeling doesn't change. It just moves. One finish line collapses into the next. One expectation replaces another. And underneath it all, something inside you keeps whispering, you're not there yet. And maybe you've asked yourself what's wrong. Maybe you've tried to rest, to slow down, to reconnect. But even still, something stays tight in your chest. Some invisible demand that you haven't quite named yet, a mental loop you can't turn off. This video isn't here to tell you to try harder, or to let go, or to just be kind to yourself. That's not enough. Not when the root of this loop is buried so deep, it's become part of your internal language. We're going to track it, not to fix you because you're not broken, but to reveal something most people never name. A habit so familiar, so disguised as normal, that you've accepted it as who you are. But it's not. This isn't a motivational speech. This is a slow unraveling of the false urgency, the quiet and the invisible rulebook you've been living by without even realizing it. Let's start by asking a simple question. What role have you unknowingly cast yourself in? And what if that role is the very reason you feel like you're always falling short? Before anything you do, before a single action, a single thought, there's a position you quietly take inside yourself. It's not conscious, not deliberate. It's more like a subtle posture. Your mind assumes before you begin the posture of someone who's behind, someone catching up, someone still trying to earn the right to feel okay. You don't wake up and decide this. It's automatic. A small mental adjustment that happens so fast you don't even notice it. You open your eyes, remember what you didn't finish yesterday, and immediately place yourself one step below where you should be. From that moment on, your day isn't about creating, it's about compensating. Every action, no matter how productive, carries the quiet undertone of recovery. You're always trying to make up for something invisible. This is the invisible habit that begins the loop. When your mind starts from the position of not enough, every success feels temporary. You can't feel satisfied because your brain isn't searching for progress. It's searching for relief. You're not building forward. You're trying to get back to zero. And zero always moves. Over time, this becomes a lens through which you see everything. You compare yourself not just to others, but two versions of you that don't exist. The version that never hesitates, never falls behind, never loses focus. You measure yourself against an ideal so fluid that it shifts every time you get close. And because the gap is always there, your identity subtly reshapes around it. You become the one who's trying, the one who's working on it, the one who's almost there. At first, this mindset feels responsible, even humble. You don't want to get complacent. You want to grow. But over Chimi, it drains your stability. You start to live in a state of quiet pre-defeat. Even before starting something new, you already expect the friction, the delay, the inner resistance. You carry the weight of anticipated failure before you even begin. And the cruel part is that this mindset can actually disguise itself as discipline. You look like you're motivated, when in truth, you're trying to outrun the feeling of inadequacy. You confuse movement with progress, urgency with meaning, exhaustion with purpose. And when that exhaustion hits, you interpret it as proof that you haven't done enough, instead of what it really is, proof that you've been running on emotional debt. That's how the loop sustains itself. The harder you try to catch up, the more behind you feel. The more behind you feel, the harder you push, until the effort itself becomes the evidence your mind uses against you. If I'm working this hard, I must still be failing. The truth is, the problem isn't your ambition. It's the starting point. You've been living your life as if you're on probation, constantly trying to prove to yourself that you deserve peace. But peace isn't something you earn by effort. It's something you rebuild by permission. To move forward, you first have to notice this posture, this invisible way you stand inside your own mind. Because until you do, every success will feel like recovery from a failure that never actually existed. The next step is to understand how this mental positioning gets reinforced, not by goals, but by your own nervous system. The comparison doesn't just live in your thoughts, it lives in your body. At first, comparison feels like a thought, like something you're doing. You scroll, you see someone else's life, their progress, their confidence, and something in you tightens. A flicker of shame, a quiet pressure to speed up, a subtle inner wince that says, why am I not there yet? But after a while, it stops being a reaction. It becomes a baseline. Even when you're not actively comparing, you feel that same unease, that sense that you're already behind, even if there's no one in sight, because your nervous system has learned the rhythm. It's memorized the tension. You're not chasing validation. You're bracing against the feeling of falling short. This is what most people don't understand about comparison. It doesn't just distort how you see others. It distorts how you inhabit yourself. The emotional residue lingers long after the scroll ends. You could be walking alone, cleaning the kitchen, doing nothing at all, and your body is still bracing for evidence that you're not enough. Over time, this becomes an emotional reflex. Your mind starts scanning for failure before you even notice. Not to punish yourself, but to prepare, because some part of you has come to believe that being caught off guard is worse than being wrong. So you pre-criticize, you pre-blame, you lower your own ceiling before someone else can. And it's not just about success, it's about permission. Every time you see someone else who's further ahead, you unconsciously revoke your own right to rest, to feel proud, to feel safe. Your nervous system responds to that signal like it would to danger, speed up, shrink down, then to fall behind. This creates an emotional split. On one hand, you want to feel present, grounded, stable, but on the other, your body's wired to chase, to stay alert, stay unsatisfied, stay ready. You don't live from your values. You live from your comparison reflex, and that's not your fault. It's a protective strategy that worked until it didn't. This reflex becomes even more dangerous when it turns inward. You start comparing yourself to imagined versions of you, the more productive you, the more focused you, the more emotionally healed you. You don't just feel behind others. You feel behind your own potential. And that's the most subtle form of self-abandonment, believing that who you are right now isn't real, just temporary. Just a version you tolerate until the better one shows up. But you can't build peace from that position. You can't create a life that feels like yours if you're always living in defense against the version of you that hasn't arrived yet. You don't need to chase faster. You need to unwind the habit of looking for proof that you're still behind. And to do that, we need to look at where that belief lives, not in your goals, but in your identity. There's a part of you that doesn't think you're allowed to feel okay yet. A quiet fragment of self that keeps pushing the finish line further and further away. There's a part of you that doesn't know how to relax. Not because you're addicted to stress, but because a deeper part of your identity is built around the feeling of being in progress, not being complete, not being there yet, not having done enough to deserve rest. This isn't a belief you chose. It's a survival identity. It formed slowly, through years of subtle emotional patterning, moments where you felt safest when you were striving, most valuable when you were performing, most accepted when you were improving. So your system adapted. If I'm always getting better, I'll always be needed, I'll always be safe. But now, that same identity has turned against you because it can't register peace as safe. It sees calm as complacency. It sees rest as risk. And worst of all, It sees your current self as a temporary version, someone to manage, fix, tolerate until the real you arrives. You don't consciously say this, of course, but your actions echo it. Every time you reject stillness, every time you feel guilty for pausing, every time you accomplish something, then instantly replace it with a new goal. That's the fragment running the show. It's not malicious. It's protective. But it keeps you trapped in a permanent state of not. And here's the paradox. Even though it makes you suffer, part of you trusts this identity. Because it's familiar. It's safe. In the same way, a worn-out pattern is safe, not because it's good, but because it's known. And the idea of letting it go feels... it's a sort of, who would you be without the constant drive to improve? Who are you if you're not always becoming something better? Those questions are terrifying when your identity is built on the idea that you're still on the way. You start to confuse stillness with worthlessness. You tell yourself that peace is something you'll earn when the time is right. But the finish line keeps moving, and the cost of chasing it, yourself. This fragment, the part of you that always feels behind, doesn't need to be destroyed. It needs to be named. Because once you see it clearly, you stop confusing it for truth. You stop treating its voice like the voice of your future. And you begin to realize this part of you is not your direction. It's your defense. There is a version of you that's not trapped in forward motion, one that doesn't measure their worth by how much they do, one that remembers how to be not as a reward, but as a right. But to access that version, you have to interrupt the loop that tells you you're only as good as your progress. And that loop isn't just mental, it's physical, it's emotional, it lives in your body. And it gets reinforced every time you rest and don't feel safe. Because when your worth is tied to your effort, even stillness feels like failure. And the more you resist that stillness, the more you teach your nervous system not to trust it. So the next question becomes, what happens when effort becomes your only source of safety? What happens when slowing down makes you feel like you're disappearing? There's a certain kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from doing too much. It comes from never letting yourself arrive. Even when you've done enough, you don't feel it. You don't register it. You just move the goalposts and keep going. Not because you're obsessed with achievement, but because somewhere along the way, effort became your only safe state. You were taught subtly, repeatedly, that motion means you're okay. That pushing forward is what makes you valuable. That being on is how you earn your place in the world. So your body adapted. It started to feel anxious when things got quiet, restless when things slowed down, uncomfortable when you weren't actively improving, producing, or solving something. And you began to equate rest with danger, not consciously, but emotionally. You don't trust stillness because stillness feels like slipping backward. It feels like losing control, like being exposed, like disappointing someone, even if no one is watching. Your nervous system has been conditioned to interpret peace as laziness and stillness as risk. Not because it is, but because it once was. Maybe there was a time when pausing meant falling behind, when resting meant you'd be criticized, left out, forgotten. Maybe urgency was how you stayed relevant. Maybe productivity was how you stayed safe. So now, even when the threat is gone, the reflex remains. You build systems, you set goals, you structure your life with precision, but beneath it all, there's fear. The fear that if you stop, if you soften, if you let go even briefly, you'll lose yourself. This is the loop. You push to feel safe. Then you burn out. Then you panic. Then you push again. And the more you live inside that loop, the more your identity fuses with it. You stop asking yourself what you want. You only ask what still needs to be done. You stop measuring the quality of your days by how you feel and only measure what you produced. Even when you try to rest, it's not really rest. It's recovery. It's a negotiation, a strategic break so you can get back to being on. But that's not restoration. That's self-management. You become a project, a task, a set of functions to optimize. And the longer this goes on, the more you lose access to something much deeper, the quiet knowing that you're allowed to just be without earning it, without proving it, without producing anything at all. But to return to that space, something has to break the loop. And it's not another system, It's not another attempt to control the pattern from within. It's something much simpler, much quieter, and much more confronting: the choice to not abandon yourself when you're still. Because this loop isn't just about action, it's about trust. Somewhere along the way, you stopped believing that who you are when you're not trying, not proving, not optimizing is someone worth being. And until you unlearn that, nothing you accomplish will ever feel like enough. So the question is no longer, how do I push harder? It's, what part of me believes I'm only safe when I'm pushing? Which brings us to the moment where the pattern reveals itself, where all the striving, scanning, and self-pressure come into focus. Not as flaws, but as symptoms of one invisible habit, a habit you've been repeating so quietly for so long that you've forgotten it's a choice. There's a habit most people carry without realizing it. It doesn't look dramatic, it doesn't scream for attention, but it quietly shapes every part of how you move through life. It tells you how to interpret your feelings, how to speak to yourself, what you're allowed to celebrate, what you're allowed to feel guilty about. And it's this rejecting your current state as valid, not in loud, cruel ways, not with insults or breakdowns, but in subtle, constante ones. You feel tired, and instead of listening, you override it. You feel losty, and instead of pausing, you search for the nearest solution. You feel confused, and instead of asking what's underneath, you shame yourself for not having clarity. This is the invisible habit. Self-rejection disguised as self-improvement. You call it discipline. You call it accountability. You call it working on yourself. But beneath all of that is a single, unspoken rule: who I am right now is not enough. So you manage yourself. You correct. You control. You create systems, routines, goals. Not because they mean you fall, but because they help you tolerate who you are. For now. And that for now becomes permanent. Because if your self-worth is always waiting on a future version of you to arrive, you never get to feel like yourself. You're always mid-process, always half-formed, always one step behind the life you're supposed to be living. That's what emotional self-rejection does. It keeps you in a state of near constant correction. Even your emotions become things to fix. You don't let yourself feel sad, you analyze it. You don't let yourself feel proud, you immediately move on to the next thing. You don't let yourself feel angry, you suppress it, reframe it, turn it into guilt. But emotions don't disappear just because you ignore them. They bury themselves deeper. They resurface as exhaustion, anxiety, numbness, irritation, and then you criticize yourself for feeling those things too. This is why the loop is so hard to spot, because it masquerades as growth, as responsibility, as being someone who does the work. But real growth doesn't come from constantly editing yourself. It comes from being able to sit with what's here without abandoning it. Emotional self-rejection isn't always loud. It's a glance in the mirror followed by a quiet disapproval. It's a hesitation before expressing your needs. It's a small, habitual tightening every time someone asks how you're really doing and you smile instead of answering. And breaking this habit isn't about loving yourself loudly or proclaiming confidence. It's about unlearning the reflex that treats your present experience as a mistake. It's about allowing your reality to count, to matter, even when it's messy, even when it doesn't look like growth, even when it's still in progress. Because until you name this habit, you'll keep treating yourself like a project to manage instead of a person to relate to. You'll keep building systems to override your pain instead of listening to what the pain is pointing toward. You'll keep mistaking performance for healing. And the truth is, you don't need to earn the right to be with yourself. You just need to stop walking away every time you feel something inconvenient. When you name this habit, it starts to lose its grip. Not all at once, but enough for you to hear your own voice underneath the noise. Enough for you to pause, not to fix, but to witness. Because that's the real shift. Not doing more, not trying harder, but remembering how to stay with yourself. Especially when the loop tells you not to. Which brings us to the final chapter. If you've lived your whole life trying to feel ready, trying to feel enough, trying to escape the version of you that always feels behind, then you're not looking for success. You're looking for safety. And there is a way to rebuild that, but it begins in silence, not in striving. There's a moment in every self-development journey where something begins to blur. The line between caring for yourself, and controlling yourself. Between creating structure and enforcing pressure. Between discipline, and punishment. It starts innocently. You want to be consistent. You want to show up. You want to be someone who does what they say they will. So you build routines, you set rules, you begin tracking, optimizing, refining, and for a while, it works. You feel more capable, more focused, more on track. But then something shifts. The structure gets tighter. The pauses feel guilty. The moments of rest feel dangerous. You start interpreting softness as weakness, and discipline becomes less about direction and more about correction. You're no longer leading yourself forward. You're holding yourself hostage. That's when self-discipline mutates. It becomes a quiet form of self-punishment disguised as responsibility. You don't let yourself off the hook. Not because it builds you, but because it keeps you from the shame of letting go. You follow the rules even when you're falling apart. You push through even when your body says stop. You stay consistent, not out of self-trust, but out of fear that you'll unravel if you don't. And that fear, it's real. Because when your self-worth is tied to control, any sign of softness feels like regression. You stop asking what you need. You only ask what needs to be maintained. You lose access to nuance, to intuition, to internal dialogue. Everything becomes binary. Either you're staying on track or you're failing. The worst part is that you start resenting yourself for being tired, for needing rest, for feeling off. You think, if I were more healed, I wouldn't feel this way. Or, if I had better habits, I wouldn't be struggling. But struggle isn't a flaw. It's a signal. And when you punish the signal, you lose the message. Eventually, the habit of correction becomes your emotional baseline. You monitor your mood, your focus, your body, your reactions, always scanning for something to improve. And when you slip, even slightly, your reflex isn't compassion. It's internal tightening, mental friction, a sudden impulse to fix it now before things spiral. But nothing is spiraling. You're just human. You're cycling through emotional rhythms the same way everyone does. The difference is that somewhere along the way, you were taught that discipline means overriding those rhythms instead of working with them. Real self-discipline isn't about control. It's about relationship. It's the ability to listen inward without collapsing, to hold a standard without turning it into a weapon, to create structure without using it to silence your own signals. You don't need to abandon your routines. You don't need to stop showing up. But you do need to ask, who am I being loyal to when I override myself? The part that wants to grow or the part that's still afraid of not being enough? Because if you're not allowed to feel safe while being inconsistent, then you're not building discipline. You're building emotional dependency on performance, and that's no strength. That's survival. You can be structured without being rigid. You can be committed without being cruel. You can lead yourself without threatening yourself. And when you learn to do that, the pressure finally breaks. Not because you stopped caring, but because you stopped confusing punishment with progress. Which brings us to a deeper truth. One, the loop kept hiding from you. You were never broken. Just trying to earn peace from a system that didn't know how to give it. There's a moment, subtle, almost imperceptible, when the loop loses its hold. Not because you solved it. Not because you fixed yourself, but because something in you finally stops fighting your own presence. That's what this has been about all along. Not motivation, not productivity, not clarity, safety. The feeling that you're allowed to exist in your life without performing for it. The sense that you can be still uncertain, undone, and still belong to yourself. But when you've lived inside the loop for years, the loop of trying, proving, chasing, bracing, stillness doesn't feel safe. It feels like failure or exposure or disconnection. So you keep moving, you keep monitoring, you keep adjusting your state to match who you think you're supposed to be. And the cost of that, you start to forget how it feels to just be. Internal safety isn't built in a single moment. It's not something you achieve. It's something you remember and then choose over and over again even when your system tells you it's not time yet. It starts quietly. The moment you feel tired, and instead of pushing, you pause, not because you've earned it, but because you heal out too. The moment you feel lost, and instead of shaming yourself, you stay present, not to fix it, but to witness it. The moment you resist the urge to become someone, and instead let yourself be someone. Each of these moments rewires something deeper than thought. They shift the language your body speaks to itself. You stop being a problem to solve. You start becoming a place you can return to. And from that place, the need to constantly perform your worth begins to soften. The pressure loosens, the noise quiets. You realize you were never behind. You were just outside yourself, measuring your life from a distorted angle. Now, you're turning inward again. Slowly, intentionally, without urgency. This isn't the end of the loop, but it's the end of believing it's your truth. Because when you learn how to sit with yourself, not as a project, not as a performance, but as a home, something changes. You stop outsourcing your stability. You stop chasing your worth. And you begin to build your life from a place that no longer needs to be proven. You don't need to become someone better to deserve rest. You don't need to earn your peace through exhaustion. You don't need to perform clarity in order to deserve kindness. You are already here, and that's enough. Let this be the first moment that counts, not because it's perfect, but because you didn't abandon yourself inside it. There's a kind of silence that only comes when the noise inside you finally loses its power. Not because you conquered it, not because you silenced every doubt, but because you stopped mistaking it for truth. You begin to see it, the loop, the pressure, the endless driving, for what it really was. Not failure, not dysfunction, but a long, exhausting attempt to feel safe in a world that once made you feel unsafe in your own skin. You were never broken. You were adapting every unfinished goal, every internal correction, every moment you criticized yourself for being too much or not enough. It was all part of a deeper negotiation. A way to survive when you didn't yet know you were allowed to just be not perfect, not improving, just here. And now, something has shifted. Not everything. Not instantly. But enough for you to recognize that your pain was never proof of weakness. It was evidence of how hard you've been working to hold yourself together. You've done enough holding, enough managing, enough bracing. You can put the internal weapons down. This doesn't mean the old thoughts won't return. They will. The loop doesn't vanish overnight. But next time it whispers, you're behind. You'll know it's not the truth. It's just a memory of who you once had to be to stay afloat. And now, you don't need it. You're no longer building a self to prove something. You're building a home. You can return to one that doesn't punish you for being human. One where discipline is rooted in respect, not fear. Where effort doesn't mean something. Where progress isn't bought at the price of your peace. You don't need to chase clarity. You become clear by making space for who you already are. So let this be that space. A moment not of achievement, not of control, but of quiet return. Back to the version of you that was never behind, never broken, just waiting to be heard beneath all the noise. You're here now. That's enough.